My name is Bob Orr. I am the Dean of the School of Public Policy, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this event today on connecting racial justice with equality for LGBTQ plus persons. It is a culmination of a number of conversations that we've had in the school. Over recent months, the amount of work that our community has been putting into anti-racism efforts is really unparalleled, I think, in the history of the school. We've been working hard on anti-racism, and in the course of those discussions, it has become very clear that there are many elements of our work on anti-racism that have special dimensions that need to be addressed, that need to be thought of not only as important in and of themselves, but also in the relationship to our anti-racism work. And it's in that context that this panel was born today. I think that the long-term commitment of the school, both to anti-racism, but also to equality for LGBTQ plus and all members of our community, this is a long-standing commitment, long-standing concern, and I really hope that today's discussion will help us seed the ground for the next generation of our efforts in this area. So I really thank all of you for joining us this afternoon for this. I'd like to introduce our two panelists and our moderator today. First, I'd like to introduce Chloe Schwenke. Many of you may know, many of you may have had classes with Chloe or know Chloe from various activities. Chloe is a faculty member and an international development practitioner and ethicist, as well as a human rights activist. She is the founder and president of the Center for Values and International Development and has held senior positions at the International Center for Research on Women at Freedom House and as a senior political appointee under President Obama, assigned to USAID's Africa Bureau, where she focused on human rights, gender equality, and LGBTQ plus issues. Chloe is an honorary member of UMD's LGBTQ plus Equity Center's Lavender Leadership Honor Society. And she is the author of her memoir, Selfish, A Transgender Awakening. Welcome, Chloe. Our other panelist today is Jay Gilliam. Jay is the Engagement and Communications Advisor in the Center for Education at the U.S. Agency for International Development. Previously, Jay led the Human Rights Campaign's global program to advance equality for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people everywhere. Jay served in the Obama administration at USAID, where he worked on program policy, public engagement, and communications, particularly on the agency's LGBTQ plus work. And finally, let me introduce Claire Dunning, an assistant professor here in the school, and a political and urban historian of the United States in the 20th century. Claire focuses on the history of poverty, inequality, governance, and nonprofit organizations in American cities. Claire is currently writing a book on the history of public-private partnerships in cities from the 1950s to the present. I think you will find that in these three individuals, we can know that we're going to have a rich discussion, but I cannot promise what direction it'll go because they could take it in many directions. With that, let me just say what a pleasure it is to host this distinguished panel and to welcome all of you to this conversation today. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dean Orr. Let me echo Dean Orr's welcome to both of you, Chloe and Jay, and to all of you who are joining us for this conversation. I'm going to start, I think, with some framing questions to sort of get us started. And I want to ask about how each of you connect racial justice to equity for LGBTQ plus persons. And Jay, I think I'm going to start with you.
Sure.
So as Dinor said, like many entities, the School of Public Policy has made anti-racism a top priority this last year, and we have a series of action items involving students, staff, and faculty. And given the persistence of structural racism and the continued rise of white supremacy movements, this attention is necessary and overdue. At the same time, we know that discrimination based on race is not the only access of inequality, and that discrimination based on sexual and or gender identity within and exists within and parallel to and intersects discrimination with Black, Indigenous, and people of color, which is a long way of saying, how do you frame these two issues as intersecting, parallel? What are the connections here?
Sure. Well, thank you, Claire, for that question. And thank you, Dinor and the school for inviting me here and being able to share a little bit about my life and experiences and thoughts on this issue. For me, the politics is actually personal on these issues. I live at the intersection, and so I'm confronting both every day. I identify as a Black man, and I identify as a gay man, and sometimes I can separate those issues and sometimes I can't. And so, there's been many instances where I've seen discrimination by being Black that's happening within the LGBTQ plus community. Just this past week, I was thinking about and experienced a couple of microaggressions. One was on house hunters. There was a recent episode where two gay men out west were looking for houses, and they would look at this brown house and be like, "Oh, that brown house is so ugly. I want something white that's fresh and clean." And that made me think about, what is the message that they're putting out about the color brown, the people that have that color on their skin? What kinds of things are they communicating through that? And also thinking about, like, now national LGBTQ organizations are just now getting Black leadership to really lead those organizations. And for so long, they had been led by by white men particularly. And so, the really issues that come forth from the Black community, from other persons of colors, weren't really moving forward in the LGBTQ movement. And so you can see that, from one side, the movement in the LGBTQ space has not always been ready to address challenges and issues within Black and other POC communities. On the other side, there is discrimination about being gay in the Black community. There are often negative portrayals or even just invisible ones. So we think about Bayard Rustin, right, who was the right-hand person to Martin Luther King Jr. and for so long had to stay invisible about his gay identity. We think about gay people and LGBTQ people in the Black church and often not being able to be highly visible and out. And then we think about some of the other detrimental portrayals and messages in the Black community around being LGBTQ, whether that's the phenomenon a couple of decades ago about being on the down low, or some people thinking that being gay is a white disease, right? And so I've had that come on all different sides and different discriminations. So it's really hard to separate. But what I do see in some of the connections to both of these movements is that, at the root cause of all of them are these isms and phobias that are playing to not respecting the human dignity of all of us, right? So those same forces that are privileging whiteness or privileging male identity or privileging being heterosexual are the same ones that are affecting all of these different movements. And so those are really the connections. And I think once we really can understand those connections, we also understand we can't just work on one issue at a time, right? Because they're all really interconnected. And so I think, while white supremacy and anti-Blackness are visible right now, and rightly so from all that has happened in the past year, that also doesn't take away and shouldn't take away from the fight for others' rights to be addressed through all the isms and phobias that we have. And so we have to just really learn to walk and chew gum at the same time.
Thank you, Jay. That sort of opens up. Now I want to ask Chloe, right? Sort of similarly thinking about how Jay talked about the personal, the professional, the way these things shape who we are and approach this work. I want to ask you, what do you see as the most dangerous threats right now facing transgender, intersex, and non-binary people today, either in the United States or around the world? Bring that angle for us.
Yeah, with pleasure. And let me first start by just thanking all of you for putting this together, and Dean, for your really very generous introductions, and all the people behind putting this together. It's been really a wonderful coming together around some topics that are really quite important. Like Jay, it's appropriate that I introduce myself as an openly, in my case, an openly transgender woman. That's who I am. I don't shy away from it, but it's an important place to bring myself to this conversation because, frankly, there aren't very many transgender people, and our voices are often not heard. And that's one of the challenges: is creating spaces for trans people's voices and stories, their narratives to be told, to really get us to a place where, where, as Jay was talking about, the engagement in these issues is so multidimensional, and allowing us to speak across those different dimensions is so important. I come from, 30 years now of working in international development, and many of those years spent in developing countries, 15 years in Africa for a start. And there, the issues are not so much direct racism, but they're ethnic rivalries and all kinds of conflicts in which the smallest groups, the most excluded groups, are the ones that get just churned up. They're the ones that suffer the most damage. There's really nobody there to protect their human rights. And as valiantly as they try, it doesn't happen. In this country, we see also, particularly in the trans community, but across LGBTQ, the vulnerability issues is important because, look at transgender women of color. The statistics on violence against them have never been worse. This is a really sobering experience. We don't know what's driving that. We know we have to get something done about it. And hopefully under this new administration, it will get the serious attention that it deserves. There's really great examples of people working in this space. In Washington, Casa Ruby is a good example. People trying to help trans women to have a safer space and a way to earn a living that doesn't put them at great danger. But to get back quickly to your question, I guess the two biggest threats to gender identity people, I'm talking about trans people, but also intersex people and people who are identified as non-binary right now, I'd have to classify under both ignorance and invisibility. Ignorance in the sense that this is a relatively new phenomenon. And for people who don't have a particular reason to know, which is most people, cisgender people are people who are not, uncomfortable with the gender they were assigned at birth. For those people, this is not a big issue. This is not something that is top of their consciousness, and it doesn't need to be. This is not their issue. But these are complex issues. These are really challenging issues to wrap your head around. How can somebody suddenly become, a man or a woman when they were something in between, or say that I'm not any of those things. I'm just me. I don't go with this binary thing. That freaks people out, quite frankly. They don't know what to do with that information. There's a lot of fear built around that ignorance, and you get even very elevated people. Look at, Senator Lindsey Graham, the appalling questions he was asking Rachel Levine today at her nomination, hearing in the Senate. This is the first time a trans person has ever come up for a hearing. And these were really offensive questions, showing phenomenal ignorance, particularly for somebody who claims to be a medical practitioner. Really offensive. And, my heart goes out to her to have to be subjected to that. There's also just, anything you say about trans people puts a lot of people on edge because they just don't. For instance, a lot of people do not know there's such a thing as a transgender man. Our media is much more focused on transgender women, and the idea that there's transgender men is like right over many people's heads. So that's, indicative of the kind of things we're dealing about. I think my other big threat, though, is the invisibility factor. And that's, not being able to see us, to understand who we are, means that you're not seeing our full humanity. You're not understanding us as anything but some pretty pernicious stereotypes or some pretty awful jokes by stand-up comedians. This is kind of where it's at right now. Even the media, will often talk about LGBT when they're actually talking about, same-sex issues. They just kind of throw LGBT out there. The T is not really what they're talking about. Or they'll talk about the gay community, and that's not me. I mean, a lot of trans people are not gay. They don't identify as gay. They identify as transgender or non-binary or intersex. It's different, and we have different issues there. That's not getting taken out and the letters shown for what they are and the understanding built on that. There's also, I'm a researcher, and there's so little data on trans and particularly intersex and non-binary. It's just not there, and it's not there because there's so few of us. It's, you can't justify a budget to go do that kind of research. Oh, there's just so few of them. It doesn't matter. Very quickly, I mean, just to show you an anecdote, I was doing work at the World Bank as a consultant and trying to get money to do some actual research on trans issues. And a very senior economist, a very kindly gentleman, said, "But madam, you're statistically insignificant." So that meant, you're not going to get any money. There's just not enough of you to make this make sense. I'm mourning the loss. It's now been a long time, 10 years since the Oprah Winfrey Show closed, because that was like one of the very few places where people like me were just brought onto the stage and in a very comfortable environment where your average American was watching, were able to say, "This is who I am. I'm just another person." That was like one of the best things that ever happened to normalize who we are as people. But you can see, I won't get jumping into what's happened in the last 4 years, but that's so much of that has been destroyed in the last 4 years.
Jay brought up the term human dignity, and I want to bring that into a question. Chloe, I know you teach a class on human dignity, and that the concept of universal human dignity plays a really central role in your work within and beyond the school. Why this framework? Why the sort of focus on lofty moral norms when we know, as you've both spoken to and as we've read, we know that the reality is so far from that, and that marginalized people are not experiencing that equality of the rhetoric of equality in their lived experience. Why this framework, and what strategies do you see as most effective to helping us bridge this gap between rhetoric and reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's first of all, I'll openly admit I'm an idealistic person. I like to think the best of people is achievable. I'm not somebody that subscribes to the political economy analysis explaining everything, which is almost heresy in a school of public policy. No, I guess I have found some comfort in grounding things on human dignity because the issues are so immense right now. We are not talking about tweaking things at the edges here. We're talking about a quantum leap in human evolution to accommodate the kinds of issues that we're talking about right now. I mean, to think about, women, we've come so far in gender equality. We have a long way to go. But, it wasn't long ago where women were property. That was the end of the story. Women were property. And they still are in many countries, unfortunately. But the transition from property to full human beings to humanity is one of those huge leaps. Well, we're in that same kind of situation right now, at least in my community as a trans person. I mean, stop and think what we are actually doing, the audacity of it all. Human society has existed for 250,000 years, 250,000 years. And there's always been that gender divide, and it's always been immutable. Who the hell are we, this small little group of trans people, to say, "Oh no, that doesn't apply anymore"? My authentic identity is different. This is really radical, and it takes getting grounded at a really fundamental level of what it means to be a human being, because that's what we're claiming, that's what we're demanding, to respect our humanity, our dignity, and let all else follow from there. And we're not even close to getting to that point. So talking about all of the following public policy issues when you haven't even got the first level established of what it means to be a dignified human being and be accepted as that, we haven't gotten there yet. So that's where I keep my work, and it's It's been a useful lens for all kinds of public policy issues because, across the LGBTQ spectrum, but excluded populations all over the world are facing, again, fundamental dignity questions. I don't think it's, this sounds really bold, but I don't think it's beyond our capacity as a public policy school or people involved in public policy to go there and say, we're actually looking to establish and make it measurable and make it a point of advocacy, something that we call the threshold of human dignity. That's what we need to be defenders of. We need to articulate what that is. We need to be able to say, this is where everybody needs to get to, and hopefully a lot further than that. But nobody deserves to fall below that. And we're not there right now. But I would think that's a really profound statement for a public policy person, not just to say, but to be committed to.
Thank you for that. So we've sort of talked about the framing. We've talked about where some of the greatest challenges and threats lie at the moment, thinking about human dignity. I'm going to sort of pivot and think about the landscape of activism and action right now, where people are finding momentum, both with where they're seeking it and where they're being forced to respond. So Jay, you're someone who is closely following and living this intersection. What organizations are you following that are doing some exciting work at the intersections of anti-racism, LGBTQ plus equality? Whose lead might we follow or learn from on these issues?
Yeah, I think right now, from the past year, a lot of organizations are kind of awakening to be doing more, and that's really, really great. And there are some that have long recognized the intersectionalities of a lot of this work. I mentioned earlier around LGBTQ organizations and the national ones. And, it's really great to know that now all of kind of the three oldest ones have Black leadership: the LGBTQ Task Force, the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and the Human Rights Campaign. And so I'm really excited to see them lean into anti-racist work and make it and center that more. So it's and connecting that to the LGBTQ work that they've been doing for so long. And so I think you will see a lot of that start to happening over the next couple of years. The civil rights group, Black civil rights groups have actually long been recognizing LGBTQ plus rights, which I think runs a little bit counter to what we often hear in the media around tensions between Black and LGBTQ people. But the NAACP, Color of Change, Black Lives Matter, they are all have been on board with LGBTQ plus matters. And as probably many of the people on here know, Black Lives Matter was started by queer women of color. And so they are intricately connected to both issues. And while they're centering the work around Black equity and equality, they've always made sure that queer issues are a part of that. And so I just really love the work that they're doing and the leadership that they're showing within the movements that they're a part of. If you think a little bit about groups that are doing and working in those intersectional issues, there's organizations like the National Black Justice Coalition, the Center for Black Equity. So those work particularly on Black LGBTQ issues. There's the National Queer Asian Pacific Islander Alliance, or ANCAPIA, that works at the intersection of LGBTQ plus and Asian American issues. And so there's a number of ones that have had to form because they, like Chloe was saying earlier, they haven't had a voice. They were invisible for so long that they formed their own organizations to be able to lift up the issues and challenges that they were having from all different sides. And I think around the Washington, D.C. area and in Maryland and Virginia, there's a lot of great local groups doing this work at the intersections. Chloe mentioned Casa Ruby, which is one, but there's also ones that are working on youth issues. And we know that youth are more likely to identify as being LGBTQ plus than older Americans are. And it shows in the organizations that they are part of and that are catering to them. And so you get organizations like SMILE or the Latinx History Project or Advocates for Youth that are working on the intersectionality of a lot of these issues. But you also get a lot of service organizations like the Wanda Alston House or Us Helping Us that are having leaders of color who are serving their communities and doing that work. And Casa Ruby is definitely a part of that. And so there's a lot of organizations, and I think, everyone just has to kind of do the work and dig down into where they are to be able to support these organizations.
I just add something to that, just because my domain is in the international space. And in the last 3 years, there's been a plethora of small LGBTQ organizations springing up in the most unlikely places, all over Africa for a start. They're existing on a shoestring, and often in countries that are very dangerous to be openly LGBTQ plus. But they're there and they're not going away, and they're often harassed and subjected to violence, but their courage is remarkable, and they need to be supported. They need to be recognized and supported. And just the fact that they are part of the process now, they're forcing themselves to be part of the discourse, and it's so inspirational to me.
The radicalism of existing, right? You were talking about earlier, of just claiming space.
Yep.
And I think that's so powerful and critical and exhausting in this work. But Chloe, I want to ask you an activism question also. I know you've been tracking with others that at least in the US, there are at least 20 states, right, that are currently trying and sometimes succeeding in passing legislation that openly discriminates against transgender persons. How can we broaden the base of support for equality, for rights of transgender people? Where are you seeing the activism and momentum, similar to what Jay described?
Well, it's very topical. I mean, right now we have in Congress the Equality Act. And if we can get that passed, and we've seen a lot of people get excited about that and build a real sort of support base around that. This is something that its name says it all. This is exactly what we're talking, you talked about before, human dignity. It's almost the same thing, equality. This is what we're trying to do, is say no more sort of little lost pockets anymore. This is all people get treated with equality and respect and dignity. And, this is the time. Right now is the time to get the Equality Act passed. And if people are interested in supporting this, this is the time to write to your congressperson or senator or whomever to push this through. I think there's been a lot of organizational efforts to get people to focus on this right now. It needs to pass. It really does. But, the other thing is to understand that we are gradually changing. We as a country are getting more accepting of LGBTQ people, despite the messaging coming out of the extreme right. Despite the fact that there are some genuinely scary groups out there pushing a lot of this legislation. This legislation is not the groundswell of the people. Even in the reddest of red states, the majority, polls show this, the majority of people accept LGBTQ people as equal. So we're talking about, groups like the Heritage Foundation and a few others that, some of whom are actually designated as hate groups, who are out there writing basically pattern book legislation to discriminate against people like me, and often people like me who are even more vulnerable because they're young, and in the most egregious kinds of ways, denying them just the basic rights to be a human being. It still affects me. I mean, I can't use a bathroom at Houston Airport. I'm not allowed to use a ladies' room at the airport or any public facility in Houston and other cities as well. This still goes on. It's not just, here or there. And the fact that we've still got 17 states that are literally at this moment writing, anti-trans legislation driven by these hate groups and these right-wing groups, we have to call them out, basically. That's the main thing. It's just say, everybody, look what's going on. This is not a democratic expression. This is the expression of the extreme right. We're becoming sensitized now to how dangerous that is. Let's make sure that in this context, that also gets recognized.
Jay, I want to ask you, I'm so glad to have at the School of Public Policy today, how would you challenge us as a school to be more effective in our advocacy for anti-racism and inclusion? Given what you and Chloe have just mapped, how can we as a school step up our work?
Yeah, well, I think this is a great start, but I think you should continue to use the privileges and the resources that you have, and be able to focus in more than one area of the advocacy work that you do. I talked a little bit earlier about kind of walking and chewing gum. There is a lot to unpack on all these different issues, but I think a university like you all have the resources to be able to do that. One, I applaud you for wanting to focus on anti-racism and white supremacy, but I want to caution you to not just make it a black and white issue. Even as being a Black person and knowing that that is a very important part of it, I also know that those same forces of white supremacy are affecting other people of color and communities of color as well. We can only look at, the recent news around anti-Asian American sentiment because of COVID-19 and the harassment that our Asian American siblings have been facing because of that. To see that it's not always just a Black-white issue, but those same sentiments affect everyone. And so we've got to find a way to be able to tackle them. And I love, Chloe mentioning that universal human dignity, because that really gets at what the moral compass for all of this work should really be doing, is making sure that we all have human dignity and value and worth. Some other ways that I would challenge you all is to, continue to be more inclusive and think about all of the intersectionalities that happen. Continue, this topic on race and LGBTQ issues are great, but think around other intersectional issues, socioeconomic and health and finance are also really important, that are going to include race, but are also going to include beyond the Black-white divide, but also bringing some other issues and groups and constituents that can be part of that conversation. And also using your resources and privileges to be able to support groups that could be natural allies, and giving them the resources to work together. And so I'm thinking about, the push for $15 minimum wage, or voting rights, or labor unions, right? These obviously have a racial lens to them. But again, going back to Chloe, they also have kind of a universal human dignity framework that they're trying to push to make sure that we all have access to vote, that we all have dignity, get paid for the work in a dignified manner, right? That we can make sure we have safe workplaces. And so thinking about these issues in those kind of intersectional ways too, I would challenge you all. And then lastly, just continue using your voice and convening power to create spaces like this, to discuss these topics, to introduce policies, to advocate for those policies, like Chloe was saying around the Equality Act. And I was looking at the website and saw that you have some new course offerings on race and social justice. And so I think that's a great start to be able to do that within the student population and the professors and administration. So continue doing things like that to create space and create real dialogue around these issues, and policies that can provide solutions to the problems. And then lastly, just in terms of continuing to think about LGBTQ inclusion, just reach out to some of the organizations that we've been talking about, particularly the local ones around the DMV area, and find ways to work and support them. They can really use that support and resources from a university like yours to really continue making gains and strides in what they're trying to do.
Thank you. I'm trying to be mindful of the clock, and I'm already seeing some questions come in the chat. So I want to open up this conversation to the chat, but while I do so, I'm going to ask a couple lightning round, sort of fast questions for Chloe and Jay, which is a cue to you all in the audience to get your questions going in the chat, to give us some material once I take a look at that in a second. So quickly, Chloe, Jay, you've both worked in the federal government and are no doubt watching the new Biden-Harris administration and to see what they're going to do around human rights, LGBTQ rights, racial equity. What are you hoping to see?
I want to see more of us. I want to see more openly LGBTQ people, and not just because, not in sort of a nominal sense, just to normalize the fact that we can work well, we can be competent, we can get things done, and just get used to having us as your workmates, as people that are just at your side. It started under Obama in quite a profound way. I was the first trans appointee ever in the Foreign Affairs Agency. So there needs to be a dozen more trans people in that space, and many, many more lesbian, gay, and bisexual. And we've got to start doing some work on non-binary people. You know, this is the next big wave that needs to be thought about right now. And it's going to be a really tough one. So I would love to see this administration make all of the LGBTQ spectrum, and especially Q right now, and intersex people and others that are just so marginalized. Let's see them. Let's see them in place. Let's see them there. Obviously, I also want to see more money. You know, I see so little money being spent on programmatic work for our communities, both domestically and internationally. It's nominal right now. It needs to be robust. It needs to be significant.
And I would add on to what Chloe said, and in terms of the people, also thinking about those that have those intersectional identities, right? With race, with LGBTQ issues, with disability and other things, to make sure that they are raised up in giving real titles and jobs, and to be able to do the work. And like Chloe said, for people to see them in positions of leadership. Because I think that role model and examples are really important, particularly at this time. And also, adding on to the programmatic part, to think about, how can the federal government really work to address the needs and challenges of those that are most marginalized, which often have multiple marginalizations within them. And we were talking about earlier, Black and Latinx trans women have terrible livelihoods, right? Shortest livelihoods, high murders, not a lot of economic opportunities. So what can the federal government be doing to best support them and really lift up their human dignity?
Thank you. I want to turn to some of these questions in the chat. I have more queued up, but I've gotten to ask a lot of my questions, so I shouldn't hog all the attention here. I want to note a conversation that happened in the chat about whether the new School of Public Policy's building, I think if I'm capturing this right, will have all gender restrooms and what that's going to look like. And the dean responded that that's an active conversation and there is going to be an all gender bathroom in our building. So I just want to name that was something that's being discussed here, and an important one that happened in the design planning for the new building. Question here is, Claire says, some people erroneously see justice and progress on the fronts of anti-racism and LGBTQ plus issues as zero sum, when in reality, as you've both talked about, they're deeply interconnected and aligned. How can folks work to dispel this thinking, whether in an individual or institutional capacity?
Well, we can stop taking sides and getting so angry at each other. I mean, one of the worst things we can do as marginalized groups anyway is get on each other's case. And I've already run into that at the school, as some of you know. There's no space for that. We have such important issues that we share right now that we have to find the places that we come together, and we have to support each other in that sort of advocacy. I would argue that we have to get comfortable using a moral language. We are fighting a fight for human dignity, and we should start using that language. Our legacy as a school, we came from the Institute of Philosophy and Public Policy. Let's reclaim a little bit of that and sit tight with the fact that we're champions for human dignity. I think as Jay was saying, I would love to see us expand our outreach to a lot of local groups and organizations that are working in this space. I think that would be putting our words into action and giving students a real chance to see what this means in practice. That would be really powerful. The last thing I would say is, give us opportunities to do what we're doing right now, to have conversations with I want to just give some kudos and shout out for the LGBTQ Equity Center on the campus. They're doing a fabulous job. We need a lot more of that.
Yeah, and I would add, in terms of kind of that zero sum, part of it is those that don't live at the intersections need to earn their allyship and really need to learn what are the issues that the other people are in that group are facing. I think learning that will kind of make disappear that it's not a zero-sum game, that we're often fighting those same forces for equality, right? And so that's one part. And the other part is, continue to give visibility and voice to those that are living in the intersectionalities of this, so that people like me can share about issues of discrimination or challenges that I face from both communities, but also ways that I've been able to draw strength from both, and that have found power and bridging those groups together. And so, I listed some of the organizations that have formed to be able to raise those voices at the intersection. And so making sure that you're leaning on those folks to also be able to understand what's happening.
Thank you. Betsy has a question here, giving a shout out to churches who are working on this issue and bringing in sort of a church or faith angle on this. Focus, here we are, the Rockville United Church in particular, she notes, is committed to this. Are there ways that either of you foresee partnering with smaller local groups and churches to further progress in this area?
Well, I mentioned before the problem of ignorance and the problem of invisibility, and these kinds of groups can solve both of those, or at least make considerable progress in that space. Getting a place for people like us to come and speak and dispel some of the ignorance, and let people see that we're actually human beings, we're not scary. And just what Jay was talking about, learning your allyship. It's one thing to have a sort of intellectual notion of I'm in solidarity with you. We can tell you some pretty horrible stories, and that you need to hear them. They're stuff that I know that a lot of us have faced, and we need to be aware that this is not just talk. This is really going down right now. So harnessing those kinds of energies from an expanding public, and then challenging people in those communities to do more. Don't just be here for us to talk. Think of active ways to get involved as our allies, and we're going to leave you to do that, because we can't manage. Certainly, the very few people who are trans, we don't have that capacity. But we have to trust that you're going to carry this forward.
Yeah, and I would just add, in terms of being able to partner and work with churches, there are indeed quite a few churches, particularly in this area, that support LGBTQ equality, that are leaning into anti-racist and white supremacy work, could be natural partners and allies in this work. Unfortunately, I think those kind of progressive churches and congregations aren't the ones in the news, aren't the ones that are getting the visibility and having their voice heard. And so, actually, some of the things this school could be doing is to help elevate those voices, to figure out, what are Christians today really thinking about these issues, and how are they trying to do the work and elevating some of that research to help drown out the conservative Christian voices that are often in the news, and helping to frame the arguments around these particular issues.
As much as Zoom is a challenge these days, one thing that I love is I truly love the chat feature. And we've got Bill updating us on live news unfolding as we're having this conversation that the House just passed the Equality Act. So that feels really special to be here with you all, as more steps to happen, but it feels special to be here with you while we're getting these updates in the chat. I love this.
Thank you.
That's so great.
So a question from Shige, and I'm probably pronouncing your name wrong, and I apologize for that. Picking up, Chloe mentioned and called out the LGBT Equity Center staff at UMD, saying that they're one of the few LGBTQ plus community or issue focused government employees in the state of Maryland. Do you foresee more government jobs that focus on our communities and perhaps also intersections of LGBTQ plus biopic also?
What do you think, Jay?
I hope so.
I hope so too. I can't see it necessarily, but I hope so.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm excited about with the Biden administration is I think they understand the importance of data that Chloe was talking about earlier for LGBTQ people. And so hopefully that will materialize in hiring people that can collect that data and help analyze that data. from all different sources and all different areas of our lives, which I think is really important and will also help bolster the data that we already have on people's race and give us a better understanding of the intersectionalities between LGBTQ and racial issues, and probably eliminate even more brightly the hardships and challenges that people who live those intersections really face.
You know, just to recall what happened when I was working with the Obama administration, there were 3 trans appointees, Amanda Simpson, Dylan Orr, and myself. And very early in our time, we were summoned to the White House, which was kind of like, oh my God, to meet with very senior people, including the White House Chief of Staff. I mean, these were not sort of low-level functionaries. These were very senior people. And we sat down feeling very nervous and out of sorts, kind of, but impressed. And they looked at us and they said to us, what can we do for you? If governments ask us those kinds of questions, we can give them answers. And I love the dynamics of that, the fact that they as public servants are reaching out to the community to say, we're public service, what can we do for you? I would love to see that replicated at all tiers of government. I mean, I've never stopped being so inspired by that meeting.
To ask and not tell.
Yeah.
Genuinely to ask. Thank you. So not only is Bill updating us on current events, he also put a question in the chat, very active, which is fantastic. And I want to pose it to you both, that politically, how much emphasis would you put on championing human dignity overall versus focusing on specific expressions of failing to uphold dignity? Obviously, both are needed, but where would you push the current balance in one direction or the other?
You know, I've been around public policy for a long time, and it bothers me that we're so cynical. The basic premise of public policy is that everybody's self-interested. I think humans can do an awful lot more than that. And again, a lot of the work I've done from the World Bank has been on corruption issues. And I remember at a meeting, it was like, the water and sanitation people, which is a major piece of infrastructure funding at the World Bank. I mean, talking billions of dollars. They came out with their huge manual, their sort of new policy document, 350 people there all to listen to this. And they opened up these 9 authors of this great big publication by saying, we've got 30% of the money that governments spend on water and sanitation goes missing. And everybody in the room sort of were wringing their hands and gnashing their teeth as one does. And I put my hand up, I said, can we talk a little bit about the 70%? Can we talk about the civil servants of integrity that are doing their job for all the right reasons and what that money is getting us, that there are people that really care about doing the public good, and that we should be raising conversations at our school a lot more about public service and making that sound like it's not such a quaint notion anymore, that human dignity can be made manifest by people's commitments and their sense of mission, and that's not to be trivialized.
Yeah, and I would add to this question, it's a political question, right? And you got to read the room in terms of where you are and who your audience is and how you're going to approach the topic. I think obviously universal human dignity is kind of the groundwork and the North Star for all of the equity and inclusion work that we're doing. But you might need to use that universal human dignity language with a white audience to get them to really get on board with what you're trying to do, as opposed to if you're talking to a Black audience, like we want to hear that you're going to be fixing issues and that we're bringing up to you and that you are really hearing us and addressing those particular needs. And so I don't think it's, maybe as the question is framed, it's kind of like you're always having to choose which argument you're making to everyone. But I would also just frame it as, think about who you're talking to and how you're going to move people along to what you want them to do, which is really to recognize universal human dignity of everyone, and what's the best approach that you can do to get people along with you on that same goal.
Well said.
Indeed. We have a question from David, sort of bringing in conversations that we're seeing on the Hill that Senator Romney and others have been asking a lot of the Biden nominees about high school girl athletes who feel disadvantaged when competing against a transgender girl who's physically more robust because they started life as a boy. What's the definitive reply there?
That they're ignorant. I mean, that's the definitive. There's just not data to back up that trans women, trans girls are any better. I mean, they're taller probably because they had a growth spurt and you can't undo that. But let me tell you, when you start on estrogen, that muscle is gone. I mean, you lose muscle mass almost immediately. It turns to fat, it gets relocated. I can't pick up those heavy suitcases anymore. I can remember what that was like. And that went so quickly when you start doing this. It's also, there are so few trans girls in this situation. It's, you know, what is the option? The option is to not let transgender girl athletes have any competitive space. Is that really, is that fair too? I think that we're not seeing trans women athletes sweeping in and taking all the prizes, are we? I mean, get the data and really look at this and see that this is the bogeyman. This is like saying that trans women will go in the ladies' room and they will be predators on women and girls. That's never happened with an actual trans woman. It's happened with some men, but it's never happened with a trans woman. Yet this is the kind of fear mongering that goes on, and Governor Romney, Senator Romney now should know better. He really should. This is not okay.
I think that's well said, Chloe. I would just add, I have a lot of issues with sports and how much oxygen it takes up in our society and in lots of societies. And for issues around race, how exploitative it is for student athletes in general, but particularly for students of color. And so I would just say there's so many other things that these senators should be thinking about and trying to fix our country other than talking about trans students in sports.
Absolutely. Thinking about priorities of airtime and the data piece, central to all of this. As the moderator, I get the prerogative of asking a question towards the end, right? And I want to hear, and this has been a really uplifting conversation. I wasn't sure, right, where we were going to go and where our energies were going to go, but this has been uplifting. But I still want to end on a question about hope and ask, what gives each of you hope in this work when this work can be tiring, exhausting, personally painful, right? What gives you hope?
I guess for my sake, just how stubborn we are. The fact that we are not going away. And I see people facing almost insurmountable odds, because I work with mostly trans people in developing countries who get the crap beat out of them all the time. They get treated terribly. They have no prospect of getting their identities ever legally recognized. That means they can never get a job. They can never buy an airline ticket. They can never, get married. They can never do all of these things that you need a name for and an identity. They are non-persons. They're invisible, and they are fighting the fight. They are standing up to this in the face of, anything beyond our imagination. Very briefly, I have a wonderful friend who's called Beyonce, a trans woman in Uganda. She's a sex worker. It's the only way she can live. And I used to be a Fulbright professor in Uganda. I got to know her very well. I've been going to Uganda for many, many years. Anyway, she's a really good friend. Every time I go there, I buy her lunch. And she usually eats about 5 lunches because she hasn't often eaten for days. And she's been in the hospital so many times for being beaten up by people. Beyonce runs a small NGO. She's now got 18 young transgender women, and she is basically their mom. And she is supporting them and guiding them how to live their lives with authenticity and dignity in Uganda. I mean, for the Beyoncés of the world, I am filled with hope because they're there. And they're there in this country too, across the LGBTQ spectrum. There are people just doing the most courageous things in the name of human dignity, in the name of decency.
Thanks for sharing that, Chloe. I would say what gives me hope is that, in spite of what's happened over the past year, which has been horrendous on everyone, I think we've created energy and momentum to actually make some sweeping changes on a lot of things in terms of social justice work, racial justice, LGBTQ equality. I feel like there is more people who are open to trying to understand, to trying to make change and lift up the voices of those who really need to be heard in these moments. And so I'm just really hopeful that, you know, we continue to ride this wave of energy so that real change can happen. I think this next year is going to be really pivotal for so many different movements and the work that's being done and the change that can happen. And so I'm just really heartened by all this energy and just hope that it continues to swell so that we can have some real change happen that we haven't had in you know, at least my time here on Earth. And so I'm just really excited by that.
Thank you both for those messages of hope and optimism. Thank you. I want to note that there's a lot of enthusiasm first in the chat for all that you've shared and some resources that are being shared in the chat. Again, I love the chat. And so just want to lift up the praise and gratitude to both of you of what's coming through there, but also an interest in getting in touch with each of you. How can people find you? Well, I'm sure the school will follow up with some resources that we've named and sort of where to follow up, but can people find you online? Anything you want to share on staying in touch and continuing this conversation beyond our webinar today?
I would hazard a guess to observe that neither of us are shy. So if you Google Jay Gilliam or if you Google me, you will find us really quickly. And we're both very active out there in the space doing the work that we do. So my personal email is chloemaryland@gmail.com. So Chloe like the state, and then Chloe and the state, all one word. So I don't know how I got that email, but I did. So that's me, and you can find me, and I would love to hear from you. That would be great.
Yeah, and people can, as Chloe said, you can Google me, but I'm probably most active on LinkedIn, so people can connect with me there if they just search for Jay Gilliam. I am a little bit of a social media Luddite, so I'm not active on Instagram or Twitter, although I keep getting nudges that I should be.
Twitter's great.
Well, maybe we'll draw you in. Let me just express again and amplify the gratitude and the snaps and the amens and the sort of everything that's happening in the chat. Thank you both for sharing your stories, your insight, your wisdom, your professional analysis. Truly, thank you both. And thank you all for joining us for this conversation. It's an important one and one that I look forward to continuing within and beyond the school.
Thank you. And thank you for being a great moderator.
Yes, thank you. And thanks for giving us this platform to share about our experiences and lives.
Thank you, Jay, Chloe, and Claire for an amazing discussion. As Claire said, you know, we not only covered a lot of challenging issues, but you did it in an uplifting way that I think gives us a path forward. And just the spirit of generosity of the two of you sharing your personal experiences so freely is greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.